Hi everybody, my name is Kevin Abbott. I'm a student meteorologist at Penn State University. So I'm an undergraduate in the meteorology department, and I'm currently a junior, going to be going on to my senior year. My project that I did was flight delay forecast algorithm, which essentially looks at forecasted weather using numerical weather prediction models and the arrival and departure statistics at an airport, and then basically overlap those and create an algorithm that will forecast flight delays. The idea of what it's supposed to do is to kind of alleviate the headaches of an airport. So you should know well before you get to the airport whether your flight's probably going to be delayed and you're going to have a headache, or you should be totally fine with your flight. It's not, I wouldn't say it's so much meant for like businesses that are doing high risk like cargo shipments and things like that. Mine is for the smaller businesses that can't really afford that, or just any everyday passenger that frequently flies that kind of wants to know ahead of time whether their flight's being delayed. It's really one of the only algorithms out there that's actually forecasting flight delays. You can almost very easily find information on current live delays or maybe delays in the next hour, but in terms of actually forecasting delays, that requires an algorithm, not just raw data coming from an airport. And another thing that kind of prompted me to build this kind of algorithm was I wanted to combine my passion for weather and my hobby of aviation, and kind of do something that can kind of help other people, and also kind of learn how to code, because as a meteorologist you become a lot more valuable if you can kind of code, and that's something that we offer at our school, but I think it's a lot more fun when you get to do your own kind of program and you get to do whatever you want. I feel like I learned a lot more like that, and it's been a lot of fun. It's been a lot of fun testing it. It's been stressful at times, but at the end of the day, I'm kind of really proud of how it came out. And I guess at this point, all I want to do is just let the world know that people can use this product. It's totally free and there's no business really associated with it.
Welcome to day one of ClimaCon. Here I have Dr. Catherine Sullivan, and we're going to be talking about weather privatization. Welcome, Kathy. It's good to see you.
Yeah, great to see you, Andrew.
First, I guess we can start off with a definition. If somebody's watching this and doesn't really know what, weather privatization is, how do you define it in your mind, having been in the public sector as well as the private sector?
Well, yeah, it's got a lot of definitions for a lot of different people, and we're in a pretty dynamic time. So any definition you pick is also changing pretty rapidly. Once upon a time, but I mean, back even in the 80s and part of the 90s, all the measurements that went into a weather forecast, all the computing that produced a forecast, and most of the distribution out to us as the public was done by the public sector, by NOAA, the National Weather Service. Starting in about the 90s, companies began to get started, like AccuWeather and the Weather Channel, that saw an opportunity to step in between the government and the using public and better focus and tailor and package and explain the weather to them. They could be more diverse and more agile at doing that than NOAA could ever be, trying to serve the entire nation and all the different weather phenomena. So that to me is sort of phase one of privatization. And it's not been a takeover. It's been really, we call it the weather enterprise, because by and large, if you talk to companies in that early and current sector, they'll make clear to you how completely dependent they still are on the infrastructure that NOAA sustains and the sort of baseline, let me call them level one products that NOAA produces. What we're seeing now is sort of a next step. And in particular, with satellites getting smaller and the ability to shrink instruments, weather instruments increasing, satellites that make the kind of measurements you need for forecast with the precision and accuracy that you need are moving into the cost arena where it's conceivable for a private entity to fund that satellite and sensor themselves. And so the key thing that changes there is, up until this point, all of the data in basically everyone's forecast was 98 to 100% public data. And so the forecasts, the basic forecasts, were distributed globally, equitably, as a free public good.
Mm-hmm.
When company X now owns a satellite and has paid for it, the data it can collect is really legitimately that company's property. And obviously their business model will rely on finding customers to sell the data to. So that's, to my mind, both the opportunity and a big challenge in this era ahead. And the challenge side of it for me is, well, what will that do? What will monetization of the data themselves, what will that do to the global compact of sharing weather data that's been the foundation of the weather enterprise for the whole world up to this point? No country, not even the United States, no country can produce a really meaningful forecast like out to 7 or 10 days. It can't collect all the data to do that it needs itself. And so France, Canada, Japan, other nations all put their data into a common pot for free for everyone to use. And I think an interesting question and big unknown for the era ahead is, how will that change? How must it change? And how viable will whatever the new model is that emerges, how will that really all be for continuing to serve a global public?
Yeah, and along those lines, I've seen that as well. These many different companies that have come up and started exploring, initial testing phase contracts with NOAA
Right.
and NASA and other agencies, DoD as well, to try to evaluate the quality of that data. And one of
Right.
the concerns from the NOAA perspective that agency has expressed to me is, if we launch a GOES satellite, we're responsible for that data. We are getting that. We know the reliability of that.
Right.
What happens if something goes wrong? Well, we can try to fix it. It's ours. If we're relying on 3 companies with, small sat constellations, what happens if something goes wrong and we're suddenly missing a product that's key to forecasting, hurricane tracks? This is being increasingly thought through, and I think the private sector is increasingly capable of dealing with that. But I'm just curious, how would you be approaching this if you were still at NOAA? What are some of the questions that you'd be asking?
Yeah.
And where do you think things are headed in terms of the public-private partnership, which is the buzzword, the buzz phrase that's talked about all the time at NOAA. How is that changing, or what would your thought process be as NOAA administrator today with all the capabilities that the private sector has?
Yeah, well, just one little bit of backdrop before I go directly to your question. NOAA has been purchasing data from several providers, again, since at least, I think, the late 90s. It's been from some ground arrays of instruments that were more robust and placed in Tornado Alley, for example. And it's been from instrumentation on commercial aircraft that get, as they fly through the atmosphere, lots of profiles. But those have been data sets that help improve the accuracy of the model. They're not really, make or break for being able to produce the underlying forecast. And so that's the change that perhaps we're moving towards. And it's partly how does the private sector's capability to produce GOES-like data and polar satellite data, how does that grow, how quickly? And it's also a question of, basically, does the government sustain known and proven systems until the new capability is really proven? Or if you just put financial eye shades on, you might say, the private guys are looking pretty good. Let me take that money back from NOAA. Why spend it there? We'll spend it somewhere else, or we'll invest in the private companies. So that transition, as a scuba diver and a spacewalker, I live very schooled in the notion of you make a new handhold before you let go of the one you have. So make before break. The other view, the monetary view, is drop this one now and let's go. Let's bet on the come. So I think NOAA is likely to be, and rightly, very conservative and cautious about abandoning the known capabilities prematurely. And the other risk factor that I know we were discussing when I was at NOAA is we're in a startup phase of these new companies. And there's really a plethora of them right now. I've lost track of how many, but like the startup phase of any new segment, it's a guarantee that not all those companies will survive. So what do we do in that case if we really banked on company X for data that's actually now critical to the forecast? And if the Congress withdraws funding for the legacy systems thinking it's a done deal, what happens if that's one of the companies that doesn't make it? So two other points that I think colored NOAA's thinking and mine about this. One is about the United States itself. If you look at the landmass of the continental United States, surrounded by oceans, Pacific, Atlantic, Gulf, large mountain range, huge span of latitude and longitude, the United States has a wider array of weather phenomena with greater frequency and severity than any other country on the planet. So the importance of sound, reliable weather information to communities, to public safety, to our economy is, it's vital to every country, but it's arguably more vital, more essential to the United States. So that's one factor. It's just a unique situation for the United States itself. And the other factor is, the United States has been a substantial source of the data that all of the world's weather services depend on for years, for decades. So if we shift to company Y for our core stuff, and they go under, we've compromised the weather forecasts of every country on the planet are compromised because everyone's lost out on that data.
And then on the other side, on the flip side, the private sector capabilities are having a huge impact on other private sector companies, on companies being able to take advantage of new weather arrays that they wouldn't have had access to otherwise, new streams of data, new ways of processing data using AI and machine learning, for example. Like, how are you seeing that benefit the private sector itself? I mean, there's companies that exist primarily to process this data and identify certain things and patterns and help, improve weather forecasts for supply chains, for example, or things like that, like very kind of specialized use cases, but with a pretty big economic impact.
Oh yeah, no, I refer to that as the value added segment. And quite honestly, if I had my way and ruled the universe, I'd very much keep NOAA intact. There's certainly ways to improve its technology and its procurement, but NOAA, to me, the public function of gathering the data and collecting it globally from all other collaborating countries, that's the foundation on which all of that value added downstream processing rests. And it's both augmenting the data that NOAA has with data choices that are tailored to your needs. So the Climate Corporation, which I believe is now a part of Monsanto, it scraped masses of NOAA and USDA data to create their fundamental platform. And then as it gathered farmers as customers, it tailored into your seed type, your soil type, your moisture conditions, your region, by putting more sensors on the ground in and around those fields. So they could take a broad product that would tell you about general conditions in Kansas and drive it down to very specific guidance for each plot of land, about watering, about fertilizer, and so forth. And you're seeing that come out now in more and more companies. I mean, Tomorrow IO is another great example. Take the base forecasts, augment with a bespoke modeling layer and some additional data, fill in a key gap in the overhead with some additional microwave sensors. But as importantly, and I take more importantly, tailor the information that provides, turn it from data that it provides into really finely tailored data to, let's say, a construction company that's got 10 cranes throughout a metropolitan area. For a NOAA forecast of, fair likelihood of high winds sometime that afternoon in this metro area, that's not really helpful to them. It's helpful, but suppose you could tell me, the crane you've got at the north end of town, it's got X probability, more certain level of probability of high winds in these 6 hours of the day, and the rest are going to be fine. That would tremendously affect the company's economic progress, right? They wouldn't have to secure that crane, pull people off of it, secure the laydown area. The other cranes could carry on and continue their projects.
What would you say to like enterprise businesses that aren't currently leveraging private weather data tools, systems, etc.? Like, do you think that, I kind of am of the belief that every company should be finding a way for some of this information to benefit them. I don't think people realize, like, when they go into a store to buy, to buy clothes, for example, or go into a Target, that like the temperature of that Target might be set at a central location in Minnesota based on weather forecasts, or that the stock of sweaters to choose from suddenly appeared on the shelves because of a forecast of a cold snap. Is there a particular message to like private sector companies that might not be using this that you think could be or should be it NOAA's data or a combination of NOAA and private sector?
Yeah, I think definitely so. I mean, you began citing an example that I know as well of a big box store that not only was it managed to have the right sweaters when there was going to be another cold weekend at the end of spring, but was actually on a weekly basis was adjusting their product purchasing down to the SKU level, and their advertising and end cap placement. It's going to be the first really warm weekend of the spring, so push the barbecues, pull the snow shovels out. It's much more refined examples than what I just pulled off the top of my head, but you get the point. I do think it's slow progress as people and companies really start to recognize the ways in which weather, meaning the conditions over the next 3 to 10 days, maybe 14 days, because weather forecasts are now reliable enough to give you actionable guidance out into the 10 to 14 day. You want to refine your decisions as you get closer down the road, but they're quite good. It's affecting your customers. It's affecting what they're thinking about, concerned about, interested in. It can affect your transportation routes. So there's a systemic range of impacts for many, many companies. And I don't know how many are picking it up so far. It certainly seems to be growing pretty rapidly in my experience.
Yeah. And what this is a totally different topic area, but that I have to ask you now that I have you here. You are somebody who's set records in space as well as in ocean exploration. What motivates you as an explorer in particular? Because I was thinking, approaching this conversation, like, what separates a person who goes out and does these things from, somebody who's, living a more conventional or pursuing a more conventional path, or I've listened to podcasts that you have been on and understand some of your background and motivation and kind of how you got to NASA. But like, I'm just curious what motivates you as an explorer, especially, after being at NOAA, you going to the deepest point in the ocean.
I can only come up with the one sort of underlying word, and it's curiosity, a really endless, broad curiosity, and in particular about geography in the broadest sense of that word. The geology, flora, fauna, cultures, economies, countries of this planet. What's there? What are they like? How does it work? And I have always read a lot about all those topics, but the firsthand experience is also hugely valuable to me, to be on the ground in a place and really taking the whole environment in through all of my senses, rather than just reading a description of it. And as a young undergraduate student studying geology, I had a couple of experiences that are very, very memorable, of reading about some place or some outcrop or something in a textbook, and sort of thinking I understood it in some cases, and really being puzzled and trying to understand it in other cases. And in every instance, if I got out into the field and could see that, kind of snapped into a different kind of focus and a more clear comprehension, not to claim I magically understood everything, but my sense of it was radically improved, and my focus on what would I next want to probe was much sharper. And I even found that on my first space flight. I'd been fascinated by the Himalayan plateau for a long time. And in the months leading up to that flight, I plastered the largest wall of my living room with mosaic topographic maps of the entire vast Himalayan plateau, and had a 2-foot tall stack of every astronaut photo that had ever been taken of the area, and would spend every hour I could just sort of correlating this feature to that point on the map, and picking up scientific articles and reading about the geology. And it's such a vast area with such intricate and detailed and varied geology. It was just a swirl in my mind. And on day one of our flight, we had to pass right over the Himalayas, the whole plateau, and it was sparkling clear over the whole area. And Andrew, it was a huge aha moment. It was like suddenly all those bits and pieces fell into a frame, and left me with a very different and more holistic sense of understanding the plateau. Still a shallow to moderate level of understanding, but it made some cohesive sense to me, as opposed to just being a stack of images and a collection of science papers, and struggling to hold various details in your memory.
Yeah. So I'm surprised the next thing you did wasn't go climb Mount Everest.
Yeah, well, I know a little too much about the physiology of going to those altitudes. Yes. I've had spells of being intrigued about going up to base camp just to see the mountain. I've seen Everest, obviously, but to see it from the more common human vantage point. But they're just, that for me would be just a golly gee whiz to show I could do it. And that's not the kind of challenge that draws me.
So taking a look at space and the deepest part of the ocean, obviously they have the darkness in common. When I ask you this question, that's not exactly what I'm looking for, but like, in your mind, what commonalities did they have versus differences, and what surprised you about each journey?
Yeah, so flying in space in orbit around the Earth is actually a very, very bright experience. The Earth is a bright planet. You've got water and clouds and snow. And so that's one thing that really strikes you. It's half the time it's bright, very bright and very detailed, and a spectacular span of view. And of course, in the ocean below certainly 1,000 feet, there are no photons at all. You can only see as far as however much light you've brought with me on your submersible. So that's one key difference: the expansive and kind of aspirational uplifting view that you get from orbit, which you hear so many astronauts talk about, and the much more confining, and most people would say foreboding, sense in the deep sea. It's dark, and you can't see very much. It's almost like you can imagine yourself being a 6-year-old creeping through a dark haunted house. What's around that corner? And then if you look back at the literature through all of humankind and across countless cultures, everyone has the stars and moon above their heads. And since at least the time of the ancient gods, tends to be, imagining yourself able to go there is a flight of grand fancy and imagination. It's sort of, a grand aspiration. And so much literature about the deep sea is, Homer's cold, gray, fish-bearing sea, and, tales of ships going over the horizon and never coming back, and monsters in the deep. So I think that general human consciousness about the deep of the sea versus the heights of space is pretty much diametrically opposite. There's some technical similarities in actually going into either of those places. The technology and engineering it takes to protect you from either the vacuum of space or the crushing pressures, maintain temperature, give you something to breathe, sustain your nutrition and other bodily functions for however long you're there. And as a technically minded person, I find both the common and different points there pretty interesting. But to me, the biggest difference is the expansive view of space versus the confined view in the deep sea, and the life everywhere in the deep sea versus the sort of starkness and barrenness of the orbital environment. Yes, you could look down on the Earth and see signs of things living on the Earth, including human beings. You can indeed see the hand of man on our planet. It's not quite as idyllic as some astronauts paint it. You can see borders and blotches that are cities and so forth. But still, it's kind of it's a very expansive, inspiring view. The final thing to me they both have in common is everyone who goes to either environment comes back impressed, stunned by the deeper realization of how absolutely thoroughly interconnected every single place and every single living thing on this planet is. So the Marianas Trench is a couple hundred miles southwest of Guam, sort of out in what everybody would normally call the middle of nowhere, the Pacific Ocean. It's actually quite directly connected to me in Columbus, Ohio. And we are connected there. We saw soda can, or the occasional soda can or plastic bag, bits of fiber optic cable that earlier scientific expeditions had left behind. And on many occasions, if biologists bring up some of the critters, some of the invertebrates from those huge depths, they find microplastics in the guts, even at that far from land, very remote location. So these interconnections don't seem top of mind to us in our day-to-day life. They seem distant, esoteric, maybe even hypothetical to some people. They are how the planet works. They are how our life support system works. And they are what makes this a viable planet for us to live on, and every other living thing that inhabits the planet currently.
Well, I'm going to leave it there. That was really, really enjoyable to hear you think about that. And that's something we hear from a lot of astronauts about their change perspective when they get back, including now the private sector astronauts and even space tourists who are going up there come back with a new appreciation. And the fragility of, the things going on this planet. But it's really interesting for you to just to hear you contrast these two drastically different but so similar environments. I'll just say to ClimaCon folks, enjoy the rest of the day, and be sure to listen tomorrow for more talks on space and the public sector particularly. And thanks for joining us.
Great talking to you, Andrew.